Okay, good morning to all the participants on my side, and welcome to the Eurocadres webinar on collective bargaining for self-employed. Very happy to see plenty of you here, and I think we are going to have a couple of more people. But as we are with quite a heavy schedule today, with a lot of speakers, I'm going to already start the agenda from Eurocadres' side and hand it over to Nayla Glaise. So, Nayla, the floor is yours, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen in the meanwhile, but this is just a quick look on what's in the agenda.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Ilka, shall we wait a couple of minutes for the commission to join, at least?
We have already at least one participant from the commission side, and
Okay.
Elias has said that he's having some issues joining, but at the worst case scenario, we will start with one of the national presentations before, and then go a bit unorthodox between the speakers, but nonetheless, we will find a way for this. So, Nayla, we can start off with your speaking points and then move forward with the commission.
Okay, so good morning, colleagues, and I'm very happy to see you. First, we can still say Happy New Year to all of you. I hope, even if this year didn't start very well, I would say, I hope that the next months will be better. And I would like to thank you also for joining our first activity in this European Commission funded project on collective bargaining for self-employed. As we all know, a growing number of workers, and especially professionals and managers, are not in a regular full-time working relationship with their employers. Currently, more than 27 million Europeans are self-employed, and many are in other atypical working relationships, putting more and more EU citizens in a very precarious position. The number of atypical working relationships is expected to rise in the upcoming years, while the trade union memberships has been in decline recently. Eurocadres welcomed the European Directive on Platform Workers, as well as the guidelines on the application of union competition law to collective agreements regarding the working conditions of solo self-employed persons. Many trade unions across the EU member states have developed their responses, ranging from setting agencies for freelancers to challenging the legislations to provide access to those who are not in a traditional working relationships. However, the issue is very fragmented from a country to another and also between different groups. Some may be completely barred from accessing collective bargaining, while others face uncertainty or limitations on their possibility to be present when workers' rights are being negotiated. So this project should provide research on the possible solutions and developments in access to collective bargaining for freelancers and atypical workers, followed also by awareness raising and capacity building activities for our trade union members. During this webinar today, we will have an opportunity to have a first look on the research findings of the projects carried out by Professor of Labor Law, Christina Hiessl from KU Leuven, and an intervention also from the European Commission. This will be accompanied by national reflections on the state of play in Italy, France, and Finland. So besides Christina, our speakers today are Dr. Elias Deutscher from the European Commission, DG Competition, which follows up the implementation of the guidelines. We also have Nicola Marongiu from CGIL Italy, who is the CGIL National Coordinator on Collective Bargaining and Labour Market. We have Emmanuelle Lavignac, who is the National Secretary of UGICT CGT in France. And last but not least, Markus, Chair of the Association of Freelance Journalists in Finland. So first of all, what we will see is that we will have an overview of the guidelines from the European Commission, followed by the detailed look to the research report of Dr. Hiessl. After that, we can open the floor for a quick round of questions before we move into the national examples, followed by another round of questions. So if you have a question for a speaker, please, you can raise your hand or leave it to them in the chat. I would like also to inform you that the meeting is recorded and we will share the material to the participants after this meeting. So first, I would want to hand the floor to Dr. Elias Deutscher from the Commission, from the European Commission. So Elias, the floor is yours.
So actually, I have received an email from Elias said that there's some technical difficulties still, which are making it take a bit of time for him to join. So actually, I would suggest that we start off with Christina's presentation, already giving an overview of the state of play and the study that KU Leuven has carried out on this project. So Christina, I think you can already take the floor and start sharing the slides on that one, and then we will give Elias a chance to intervene when he has joined in, because I think we have already one representative from the Commission side, but it's of course better to have the person who has been preparing for the discussion points. So Christina, if that works for you, I would like to hand the floor for you.
Yes, sure. I mean, if Deborah can take over, that's also fine for me. So it's, I mean, probably not the ideal order of doing things that we don't get the presentation of the guidelines first, but I can say a few things on that, I think. Wait a moment. I'm trying to share the presentation as such. Yeah, does that work? Are you seeing the presentation?
That works perfectly.
Okay. Then I will just start with the implementation immediately. So as we know, the guidelines of the Commission are basically trying to make it at least possible from a kind of competition law point of view and at European level to bargain collectively for the self-employed. And our project, to a certain degree, is asking itself, you know, has that had an impact in practice, and to what degree are we still experiencing issues with collective bargaining for the self-employed, as we have heard it also in Nayla's in her presentation, that there would be, like, there is an idea that there is a lot of potential in the collective bargaining for at least certain groups of the self-employed, but we are still experiencing lots of issues, and we're going to look a little bit into what has been the role of the guidelines and what problems are there still in practice. And we will see that there are many different forms of problems that we still have in this regard. What is our study all about? So we have been looking not into all member states of the EU, because the project is also a little bit more limited, but we have been looking specifically into countries where we had the feeling that there are some interesting developments going on. Yeah, we might also be adding some individual cases in future when we have the feeling that some recent developments in some countries make it worthwhile adding them. So at the moment, we're looking into 13 countries and the issues of collective bargaining for the self-employed in these 13 countries. You can see them here. I'm not going to read them all out. My presentation today will be limited to 11 countries, actually, because we have had some practical issues with finishing the interviews for Spain and France. But luckily, we will have a presentation on France today so that point of view will be added to a certain degree. So what we've been doing is that we have sought input on the one hand from legal experts, but also from union representatives on their view on where we stand at the moment and what the potential of the guidelines is and what the potential is in general for future developments. Yes, so let me start immediately perhaps with the legal perspective. So we have been looking into, to what degree is it even possible at the moment, legally speaking, in the different countries to bargain collectively for the self-employed. And there I would say there are basically three issues that play a major role. And we would start with the classification of working individuals. So the question, who is actually an employee and who is self-employed, which is super difficult in every country, basically. So with all the representatives and also the legal experts we've been talking about, this is still a very difficult issue. It's not only difficult for the social partners to say, you know, who is now bogus self-employed and should actually be reclassified as an employee, and who is basically genuinely self-employed and should also be seen as self-employed because they have important freedoms in how they're working and are not necessarily also in need of all the protections, but should still have the chance to bargain collectively when they are facing, let's say, contract partners who are just systematically in a much stronger bargaining position, so that it makes sense for the solo self-employed specifically, so the ones that are providing services, to unionize, to unite, and to conclude a collective agreement on some of the basic working conditions that they are facing in regard of a specific client or specific clients that are much more powerful in practice. So these are basically two different issues, and it's made very difficult in practice to deal with that by the fact that the classification of working individuals is still legally such a difficult issue. And you can also see that basically when you look at statistics by Eurostat, when you can see that in some countries the share of the self-employed in the working population is some, 7 or 8%, and in others it's like about 50% even. So it's certainly something where we have classification issues in all the countries. We also heard from the representatives that we interviewed that so especially from the legal experts also, that the classification is also not necessarily the same for the different areas of law. So it might be that for labor law and social security and tax law, you have different classifications. And then sometimes it's completely unclear which classification would be used for competition law, because we don't have a lot of practice on competition law. So there's a lot of legal uncertainty here. In some cases, this is actually addressed in collective agreements that specifically say, the employer side is committing to hiring these and these people as employees. And then the kind of uncertainty is addressed to a certain degree, but that's certainly still an issue in all the countries. Lots of countries also have sort of intermediate categories. So categories where you say they have some rights, but they are not classified as employees, but they have some rights that are similar to employees. And in most of those cases, this also has an effect for collective bargaining, actually. Yes, let us come to the legal assessment under the framework for industrial relations and collective bargaining. So that is what is not addressed by the guidelines. So that's very important to stress. The guidelines are only about competition law. But what we hear from the experience of different member states is that very often it's already so difficult or even impossible legally to bargain collectively under the framework for industrial relations, because the legislation on collective bargaining is very often basically limited to employees, or it's not clear whether it's limited to employees. So especially for example, for Belgium and for Finland, we heard that basically the prevailing opinion still says that only employees can bargain collectively under the normal legislation for that, meaning that in theory, it could be possible that you just conclude an agreement under private law, like civil law contract, with the principals, so the employers, so to say, for the self-employed, but it wouldn't have the same effect as a collective agreement for employees, because you don't have, for example, the automatic binding nature for the members of the organizations. You also can't necessarily extend it to the whole sector. You don't have erga omnes effect, things like this. So there's also a kind of lack of legal possibilities to even do that. What we saw, however, and that was very interesting to me, is that in most countries there is the idea that at least under the framework of industrial relations, at least certain subgroups of the self-employed should certainly be included. And the interesting thing is that actually the broadest possibility for the self-employed to conclude collective agreements seems to exist in Italy, where we have no legislation whatsoever on collective bargaining. So it's only a constitutional principle, and case law simply says, well, that also applies to the self-employed. So there's not much of an issue in collective relations law because there's no legislation for anybody, and the self-employed are simply covered. So that's kind of the easiest way of dealing with this. We heard, for example, about Ireland and Poland, that there is a relatively broad definition actually in collective agreements, so in the legislation on collective agreements, saying everybody who performs personal work or persons who perform paid work, as it is formulated in Poland after a legal amendment, a relatively recent one. Everybody who performs paid work should be included in the scope of the collective bargaining legislation. So that's actually relatively broad and provides a good basis for including the self-employed. We also have in the Netherlands, for example, a specific mention of mandate contracts or contracts for work that could all conclude collective agreements.
E quindi in questo caso c'è un contratto collettivo.
En Slovénie, il y a cette idée,
lo cual pues es muy difícil de interpretar.
We have the idea of dependent contractors, so that you're really looking into kind of the details of the case, and in order to determine whether somebody is dependent enough in order to merit being included in the legislation for collective agreements. In Denmark, there's the idea that it should be possible for those who are similar to employees, also very difficult to interpret what that means in practice. And finally, we have some very specific legislation which has existed in Germany since the 1970s already, that says very specifically, everybody who receives 50% of the income or more from a single source is considered employee-like, and therefore they are included in collective bargaining legislation. So very specific. And in Austria, a very, very recent amendment, which has been enforced for 2 weeks now, is also saying that employee-like persons are covered, but they are defined in a kind of very different way. And it still excludes basically everybody who is working on the basis of a business license, which would, for example, be the case for platform workers. So also in those countries where we basically have specific inclusions, very often the interviewees still identified groups where they say, well, for those groups that are very important, like, for example, platform workers, it's still impossible at the moment because they are not considered included in that definition. So that's also why, and that will be the last thing I mention here, there is sometimes a bit of a discussion, at least in the academia, that collective bargaining should actually be possible for a much broader group based on constitutional principles or also international treaties. You might know that the ILO, for example, and everybody has, all the countries have ratified ILO's conventions on collective bargaining. They basically have a very broad scope. So the idea is that every self-employed should be able to bargain collectively, which is also why it's so problematic if at European level we're saying that should not be possible because of competition law. So based on these principles, there's sometimes the idea that basically the scope should be much broader, but there's a lack of practice on these ideas. So mainly it's just really about academic debate. The one exception would be the Polish Constitutional Court, which in 2015 has really said, we need to include at least some self-employed. And after that, there was also a legal amendment, but that's, really a kind of exception. And now we come to competition law. So that was like what I was talking about now was only industrial relations law. And that is really national. So the EU doesn't really say anything about that. That's really up to every national lawmaker and can also be influenced sometimes by the activity of, let's say, trade unions, social partners really demanding legal change and saying we should broaden the scope. So that's really up to the national lawmaker. Competition law is very different, but competition law is very, very decisively influenced by the EU level. And that's also why basically the competition authorities and the courts at national level are really looking to the EU in terms of, what is allowed and what is not allowed. And might it be the case that when we are bargaining for the self-employed, that's actually violating competition law because self-employed are undertakings and therefore they must not enter cartels. So that's a little bit what the guidelines are all about, and we will hear about that a little bit later, hopefully from Elias. Yes, so at national law, usually there is no specific legislation that would say what are the collective bargaining possibilities for the self-employed and when do we reach the point that it would violate competition law. Sweden is a bit of an exception, where there has been legislation clearly kind of implementing the Albany idea of the Court of Justice at the European level already since the 80s. So for a very long time, saying basically, whatever is allowed at national level for the employees and basically also the dependent contractors should be exempt also from competition law. In Ireland, more recently, after an incident in which very famous one, you might have heard about that, so where the competition authority in Ireland really declared 3 collective bargaining agreements for the self-employed contrary to competition law. So there was really a practical issue with that. After that, Ireland also introduced specific legislation saying, now it should be possible to apply for an exception if there's a specific group of the self-employed that wants to bargain collectively. But in most countries, there's no specific legislation. We're really just looking basically at the European level, at the case law of the Court of Justice, and now the guidelines. in order to know whether or not competition law could be an issue if we want to bargain for the self-employed. We also talked now to the representatives at national level about what has happened in practice. Has there been a competition law issue for what is going on? And we will see later that quite a few agreements have been concluded in practice. And actually, there is really not a lot going on in practice. So it's only for Ireland that, as I mentioned before, there was really a declaration of unlawfulness, basically, for 3 collective agreements in 2004. And in Denmark, it has also happened for 2 collective agreements, if I understood correctly, and but others were also declared lawful. So it's basically 2 countries in which the competition authorities have said anything about concrete collective agreements on whether or not they were in line with competition law. And in the other countries, it has never really happened. What we also have is that in some countries, there's a little bit of guidance that has been published by the competition authority. But as I understood, in most countries, that's a rather kind of informal consultation. So I've been told, for example, by representatives in Finland and in the Netherlands that they have they have sought kind of the advice of the competition authority in advance when they were preparing to bargain for the self-employed, and they kind of told them informally, oh, it's okay, go ahead with those negotiations, something like this. The Netherlands are the only country where already before the guidelines at European level, there was a very specific framework, which was then adapted later to the guidelines. So usually also here, we are looking mainly at the European level. And then finally, what we did absolutely see for many countries is that although there is a lack of practice and the competition authority isn't doing an awful lot about collective bargaining for the self-employed, nonetheless, it does play a role, especially because it is causing discussions on whether or not it should be allowed for the self-employed to bargain collectively, and that might cause some hesitation. And in some countries, we also had specific incidences where the employer's side, so-called employers, the principals, were basically really withdrawing from prior commitments. So that's what we have seen basically in cases in Germany, and the very famous ones, of course, in Ireland and in the Netherlands, which was the FNV Kunsten case, which most of you are probably familiar with. That the employer side just said at a certain point, we concluded this agreement, but we are actually not sure whether it's in line with competition law, and therefore we will withdraw from it. Yes, and now I come to the union perspective, basically. So what they basically told us about what is going on in terms of activities for the self-employed. And I will start with representation. So the question on whether they are even unionized, the self-employed. And what I heard from the representatives is basically that this is going on in all the countries that we're studying. To some degree, but it's not like a mass phenomenon. So it's not like the self-employed are really organizing in large numbers. We also don't really have much comparable data. So as we'll see on the next slide, a few numbers, but they're all not comparable, basically. It's also difficult to define what is unionization, because some of the self-employed are also taking part in non-union organizations where they might also have some kinds of union-like activities going on, but of course no collective bargaining, because that's usually a prerogative of the unions. On the other hand, also some unions are organizing the self-employed, but are specifically not bargaining for them, and are also at the moment not trying to bargain for them. So it's also kind of difficult to draw the line here where we are even attempting to bargain for the self-employed, and where membership of the self-employed only means that they can use certain services like specific insurances or legal services, things like this. Usually we don't have legal limits to the unionization of the self-employed. So usually the national law doesn't have a problem with that. There's some very specific exception which was mentioned for Austria, that it might have an impact on the union's status in general if they are starting to include people who should be on the employer side, that it might have an impact on the union's own standing. But usually it's really, like, legally speaking, it's not a problem. It's more of a practical issue. Yes, so here are a few numbers that we heard, which are all, as I said, not comparable. So the largest union for the self-employed is certainly a German white-collar union, which has 30,000 self-employed members at the moment, which is already quite a number. They also told us that in Germany, for example, 80% of all journalists are organized. For the Netherlands, we heard that 20% of all the self-employed are organized in some form, which means either unions or these other organizations. For Sweden, for example, we heard that 10,000 out of 500,000 sole traders are organized, which is already also quite some percentage. So there is some data available, but they are on different issues, so it's not really comparable. But we can see that it's something that's going on, but that's not necessarily 100% comparable. Yes, the general observation is certainly for most countries that it's a relatively rare phenomenon. So it's not as if there's lots and lots and lots of self-employed organizing now. Sometimes, so for Slovenia, for example, it was even called exceptional that self-employed would actually join a union or organize in any way. We also heard very often that there's a focus on former employees who joined when they were still employees and then became self-employed and just stayed members, or also specifically on the bogus self-employed. So those that actually feel they should be employees, but were somehow forced or are not 100% voluntarily self-employed at the moment. We also heard that in some countries there are specific union sections for the self-employed. So the union is already kind of really integrating that in its structure and considering that as a specific group that has specific needs and also should have a specific structure. Sometimes they're also involved in tripartite dialogue with the government, basically with public authorities, very interesting. And sometimes we also heard about cooperation that is going on between those other organizations that are not unions and the unions themselves, because there could be very fruitful cooperation. But we also heard that this is sometimes very difficult in practice because the non-union organizations, sometimes they have a lot of fluctuation. They sometimes also have different aims, but it could have a lot of potential because in many countries you actually have more self-employed that are members of other associations than self-employed that are members of unions. Recent developments, actually, most countries we heard there are not many changes. It's not like this is a growing phenomenon and now we have more self-employed organizing. Specifically, we heard for Italy that this is the case, that there's a growth in the organization rate of the self-employed, specifically since COVID, which was a very difficult time for the self-employed, where they also felt the need to do that. On the other hand, we heard from Ireland, for example, that the organization of the self-employed really collapsed, specifically after the competition authority intervened against collective agreements, and then kind of the self-employed no longer felt that they had anything to gain by unionizing because there was no collective agreement anyway, and the unions also didn't seem to have the strength and the power to renegotiate a new agreement. So that's also the kind of experience that we had. Also in Slovenia, very similarly, they basically told us that there was a wave of unionization, and when they were not able to force the employer side, so to say, to the bargaining table, basically the interest in unionization just died off. So the success of the unions also determines to what degree it's possible to unionize more self-employed. All unions basically mentioned that the share of self-employment in the labor market, and especially the share of bogus self-employment, is a very important denominator basically here that determines also whether or not we will have a lot of self-employed in the unions, because most of those who are willing to organize, or many of those, are often the ones that are not 100% voluntarily self-employed. Yeah, I won't speak too much on those. The challenges that were identified, I think that's very interesting, where the unions basically said, on the one hand, there are legal challenges, certainly, having to do, first of all, with misclassification. So in some countries, they really told us that's the main issue for us at the moment. We have to focus on misclassification. There's so much bogus self-employment at the moment that we don't even want to focus too much on bargaining for the self-employed. We think we can have much more of an impact if we focus on the reclassification of those that are not actually self-employed. In other countries, we also heard about industrial relations still being a problem. So that there's still the scope of industrial relations, as I showed you before. So there's always the idea that some subgroups can bargain collectively, but it was also mentioned that it's still too narrow, basically, and that very important groups of vulnerable self-employed still don't have the right to bargain collectively under industrial relations law. So you don't even get to the point where you consider competition law at all, because it stops already at the point where you ask yourself, is it even possible under industrial relations law? For some countries, like for Ireland and for Poland, we also heard that there are so important issues with collective bargaining at the moment, problems that also concern employees that also affect the self-employed, and those are actually the main problems. So it's not something that specifically concerns the self-employed because there are already some legal possibilities, but collective bargaining as such is in a kind of a crisis, and that's affecting also the self-employed, and some legal changes could help if they were in the general system of collective bargaining legislation. And from some representatives, we basically also heard that, collective bargaining would be nice for the self-employed, but actually we think that other legal changes would have much more of an effect, like, for example, in social security. So mainly social security for the self-employed could help many more of them than collective bargaining. And generally, we were told that the practical problems are probably more important than the legal ones. So the legal ones are important and also the main ones for some countries, but for most countries, it's really more like the self-employed just still being very reluctant to organize. Also, a lack of solidarity between the employees and the self-employed, sometimes also between the self-employed. So these are practical issues that are not easy to address, probably. And in quite a few countries, we also heard that the union movement will still have to step up its efforts because they're just not used to the self-employed, or they're not aware of their needs, or they just have different priorities and don't realize that there will be a lot of potential in including the self-employed, which could also help the employees if you would deal with the self-employed, because very often there is also kind of competition between the employees and the self-employed on the market. Yes. So finally, what kind of collective agreements do we already have? So what kind of outcomes do we have for the self-employed? As you can see here on this slide, there are a number of collective agreements, not many, but a number of collective agreements. There are or were a number of collective agreements that were negotiated already before the guidelines. So it's not like before the guidelines, there was zero activity in Europe for the self-employed, zero collective bargaining activity. As you can see, there's really a focus on journalists. So that's the most important group, basically, for which some outcomes were already there before the guidelines. Also other media, television, broadcasting professionals, also artists in the broader sense, or film crew, musicians, language professionals, home workers, forest workers. So there's quite a number of different professions for which it already worked before the guidelines were there, simply based on national law. And in most countries, competition authorities never said anything about those, and the competition question was never even raised in practice. What's also interesting to see is that usually these agreements are really integrated, or at least systematically connected to collective agreements for the employees. So it's not like we have completely different bargaining structures, completely different unions or anything for the self-employed. It's usually really either a part of a collective agreement for the self-employed and the employees in the same agreement, or it's at least systematically connected. And it's also interesting that some unions mentioned that they are trying to negotiate, for example, rates like 140 or 150% of the wages that we would have for employees. So the self-employed would have the same net income because they don't have, for example, paid annual leave. They don't have the social security contributions paid by the employer and so on. So they also calculate this in a way and also try to come up with a good relation between what is there for the self-employed and what's there for the employees. We also heard about some very interesting alternatives, as I would call it. So there were collectively bargained compensation rules, for example, in some countries. So that's not really a collective agreement, but still it is something where a collective bargaining process was taking place. We also heard that in some countries there are collective agreements that deal with the classification of the working individuals, where the employer side would just commit to hiring individuals as employees rather than the self-employed, for example. We also heard about umbrella companies, which is an interesting phenomenon, where basically the union or a kind of company founded by the union will play the role of the employers. If a freelancer basically finds a client for whom they want to provide work, they're basically going to the union, and the union then plays the role of the employer and then concludes a direct agreement basically with the client, and then the worker can work under an employment contract rather than as self-employed. So that's basically kind of circumventing and solving the problem that those people don't necessarily want to work as a self-employed. And then they also fall under the collective bargaining agreements. Of course, not all the collective bargaining attempts were successful in practice. So we heard a few examples also of instances where it was just discontinued. But that's basically, so basically all of that already existed before the guidelines. It was not a mass phenomenon at all, but it existed in quite a number of countries and in quite a number of sectors. Now, have the guidelines changed anything? And there, basically, the answer was no for most countries. Up until now, we haven't seen a dramatic change because of the guidelines. The only country where the guidelines have kind of triggered the first ever collective agreement in the country was Finland. The only country where legislative change was at least inspired by the guidelines was Austria. And the one country where we have had a very active process of concluding new collective agreements was basically Italy. But there we basically saw the same thing happening already before the guidelines. So Italy is very exceptional, as we will see perhaps later. And I don't think the guidelines here had a massive effect. It's just like generally, traditionally in Italy, competition law has never really played a role, and it was just accepted that collective bargaining happens also for the self-employed. Yes, my last point, what's the outlook according to union representatives? So at the moment, basically, the idea is that there have not been many developments in practice, but nonetheless, the guidelines are seen as a potentially very useful tool, or at least as a potentially useful tool by the representatives. Sweden was the only exception where the representatives basically told us they are not very much in favor of the guidelines. Many of them also mentioned they have quite concrete plans or even already ongoing preparations of using the guidelines in practice, testing how they will, or what's the effect of the guidelines will be on the competition authority when they are assessing new collective agreements. They are thinking about collective bargaining. Many of them could also identify specific groups. I'm not talking too much about that because sometimes that's really confidential information. But there are some very concrete ideas in many countries, basically. And I've been told by representatives in some countries that they are very, very curious how the competition authority will react to them, and that they also want to really choose the cases very wisely in order to set a good precedent now based on those guidelines in order for more activity in the future. At the same time, all of them basically told me that they don't think the guidelines are not a panacea and that they are going to really change everything very fundamentally, because there's still, of course, a lack of experience in practice with collective bargaining for the self-employed. Many also think that the main focus in practice is still on the misclassification and not so much on bargaining for the genuinely self-employed. Also issues of non-compliance with the bargaining agreements that already exist. So that's for the self-employed, non-compliance is also much more of an issue than for the employees, simply because they don't have dismissal protection. So very often, even if there's a collective agreement, the individual will not necessarily rely on it because they don't have dismissal protection, and then they might be more afraid to claim their rights. Yes, and one very important issue is, of course, the willingness of the employers, so-called employers, the principals, to sit down at the bargaining table. And I think for most countries, that is really the main challenge. Yes, and then I would want to leave this last point that I'm briefly discussing already in the report, but I would leave this last point really for discussion together. What will be the way forward and what potential do we really see in the guidelines? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christina, for the great presentation and great overview. And as we can see, there is indeed quite a long way forward to go. Now, I would suggest that we return to our sort of original running order of the day. I can see that Elias Deutscher from the DG Competition is on the line, and I have granted you co-host rights, Elias, so you can also share your screen while you are at it. I can see that you also did unmute yourself already. So I believe that in this case, I can hand you the floor, so feel free to share the screen and start the discussion points. And if you have any trouble, I also have your presentation, so I can share the slides.
I'm just trying to share the screen and put up my presentation. Can you see the slides?
Yes, very well.
Okay, perfect. So let me first start by thanking the organizers, so Eurocadres and Leuven, for this very kind invitation. And also let me apologize for the delay. So even though we did a prep call yesterday and tried Zoom, it didn't work out when I tried to connect again this morning. And I also just wanted to say that I'm here together with my colleague Deborah Pistola, who is also part of the Unit A4 in the Directorate General for Competition of the European Commission. So you can think about this Directorate General as basically a ministry for competition policy of the European Commission. And this unit is also in the lead when it comes to the guidelines on collective agreements by solo self-employed persons. And we thought it might be useful, I think, for the discussion and also to put a bit in perspective the results that Christina presented in her fascinating presentation, to give you an overview on what the guidelines actually try to achieve and what we consider so far that the impact has been. And so to give you a bit of a context to the guidelines on collective agreements by solo self-employed persons. So this has been basically part of a policy package of the European Commission that was a reaction to the changes in the labor market and the significant increase in self-employment in the EU, but also together with the rise of the platform economy, which brought, on the one hand, perhaps some greater flexibility, but also in terms of downsides, in certain cases, difficult working conditions. And so the European Commission in the early 2020s tried to put forward a policy package that seeks to facilitate improvements in terms of working conditions, in particular for solo self-employed persons. And this policy package had two components. So on the one hand, the guidelines on collective agreements, which was developed by DG Competition, and on the other hand, the platform work directive. And the guidelines entered into force in 2022, the platform work directive in 2024, and this platform work directive has been developed by another DG of the European Commission. And so we will now focus really on the guidelines. So what was the objective of those guidelines? The primary objective was really to create legal certainty or address legal uncertainty that existed, as Christina also mentioned, on whether solo self-employed persons can actually negotiate and conclude collective agreements to improve their working conditions without violating EU competition law, in particular the provision of Article 101 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which prohibits agreements, anti-competitive agreements between undertakings. And so the guidelines really try to clarify a very specific legal question, namely in which instances EU competition law and this provision of Article 101 does not stand in the way of solo self-employed persons to negotiate and conclude collective agreements. So you might ask yourself now, so why is it actually necessary to clarify this question? And I think Christina already alluded to this point. So when you look at the case law of the European Court of Justice, as a general principle, genuine self-employed persons are considered by this case law as undertakings, so as companies which are normally subject to the prohibition of anti-competitive agreements. However, already in the 1990s, the European Court of Justice has also clarified that collective bargaining agreements between employers and employees, which have the status of workers, they fall outside the prohibition of anti-competitive agreements. And then more recently, the Court of Justice in the Kunsten case that Christina also mentioned extended to a certain extent this clarification from Albany also to collective agreements that are negotiated and concluded by so-called false self-employed persons. And with respect to those false self-employed persons, the Court of Justice, however, clarified that one needs to look on a case-by-case basis whether actually the solo self-employed persons are qualifying as false self-employed persons. And so the guidelines really try to build upon this Kunsten case and tries to provide further clarifications as to when EU competition law does not apply to collective agreements of solo self-employed persons. And to do so, the guidelines clarify basically 2 points. So on the one hand, the guidelines identify a number of situations where the European Commission considers, based on the case law of the European Court of Justice, that collective bargaining and collective agreements by solo self-employed persons fall completely outside the scope of Article 101, so EU competition law doesn't apply at all. And then, on the other hand, the guidelines also identify a number of situations where the European Commission considers that even though those situations might come under EU competition law, the European Commission will not take any enforcement action against collective bargaining and collective agreements by solo self-employed persons based on its power to prioritize basically its enforcement activity. And it's important perhaps at this stage to also note that all the situations that are not covered by the guidelines, they are not necessarily or automatically considered to be in breach of EU competition law. But for these scenarios, one would need again to carry out more case-by-case analysis. And when we discuss the impact of the guidelines on collective bargaining, we think it's also very important to keep in mind what the guidelines are not aiming to do and cannot do, because also to some extent the European Union doesn't have any competence. And here I think the most important point is that the guidelines do not interfere with the member states' competence to regulate social policy, to regulate industrial relations. And for instance, the guidelines do not interfere how national law defines, for instance, workers and self-employed persons. So it doesn't really engage with the qualification issues also that Christina mentioned. And another very important point is that the guidelines do not create any obligations either for solo self-employed or for the counterparties to engage in collective negotiations. So I think that's also very important to keep in mind. And so when we look at the impact of the guidelines, I think first the guidelines have been in force now for about 3.5 years, and they are binding on the European Commission. But those guidelines are also providing guidance for the enforcement by national competition authorities and national courts. And Christina also mentioned this already, the European Commission and national competition authorities are really in very close coordination when it comes to the enforcement of EU competition law. So for instance, the national competition authorities need to inform the European Commission when they start investigations, but also they need to notify their decisions before adopting them. And so the European Commission really has a very close cooperation with those national competition authorities and can also raise, for instance, with those national competition authorities, instances where the Commission thinks that their enforcement would not be in line with the principles set out by the European Commission in the guidelines. And since the adoption of the guidelines, I think what is very important for the impact of the guidelines, there has not been any enforcement action by the European Commission or national competition authorities against collective bargaining by solo self-employed persons. And if we recall what the objective of the guidelines was namely to clarify when EU competition law does not apply to collective bargaining by solo self-employed persons, I think this outcome here shows that this is basically the non-enforcement action or the absence of enforcement action is very much in line with the objectives of the guidelines, and thus would indicate that the guidelines are to a certain extent effective. What we can also say is from the cooperation that we have with national competition authorities, that those national competition authorities really take into account in their analysis of competition law issues or competition policy issues what is stated in the guidelines. So for instance, the French Competition Authority recently issued an opinion on collective agreements in the ride-hailing sector and took note of the guidelines and followed the principles of the guidelines there. However, what we also know from our engagements with stakeholders is that alongside competition law, there might be another an array of other obstacles to collective bargaining, and Christina, I think, gave you a very complete overview both on the legal and practical obstacles. And whereas the guidelines have, at least from what we hear from the stakeholders, have to a large extent removed this uncertainty about the risk of competition law liability that might prevent collective bargaining, those other obstacles are not necessarily removed. And it is, of course, important to keep in mind that this cannot be achieved by competition law, which has a very limited mission, and it is rather falling within other areas of law to address those other obstacles. And so I think when we again, when we discuss, and I will close on this, when we discuss the impact of the guidelines, it's rather the outcome variable that we should look at is, have there been any enforcement action by national competition authorities following the guidelines? And that is not the case. And it's less telling, however, when we try to measure the guidelines, whether there has been also more collective bargaining after the guidelines. So even though we see some positive examples of collective bargaining after the guidelines, there might be important obstacles other than competition law that prevent it. And I will close on this point and very much look forward to questions that you might have and to the discussion. I also need to apologize again that I forced to leave at some point, but my colleague Deborah will stay online to also follow the rest of the discussions and take any further questions.
Thank you very much, Elias, for the speaking points. I think there might have been a slight problem with the slideshow there, that it was not changing, but I believe that we can actually share your slides also with the participants afterwards. This, you are muted.
I'm sorry that the slides didn't show or didn't change.
Yeah, at some point, I think we got majority of the slides nonetheless,
Okay.
but if we can share those to the participants afterwards, that
Yes.
would be great. So everybody gets a full overview. Thank you very much. I suggest, simply because we are a bit late on the schedule and it's a tight webinar with 3 more speakers still planned. So we would actually save the questions to the end of it, and I believe that Deborah Pistola will be helping out on the questions that are coming to the Commission side. So thank you very much, Elias, for the presentation and for the contribution. And as we can see, these topics, they are really intertwined, and there's multitude of sort of problematics and obstacles that we are facing. And hopefully we will find later on this project ways to overcome those, especially when we are moving to the workshop stages that Nayla mentioned already in the earlier presentation. Now, there is, I can see that there's one question on the chat from Kate Munkrion. So in that case, if there is not more, I'm going to hand the floor to Kate. Kate, I have asked you to unmute yourself, so you should be able to do that. And Kate, do you want to present your question now?
Sure. My name is Kate. I represent the Danish Association of Professionals. And I have a question for the Commission on the guidelines, because I fully agree on your presentation and everything you said. However, I think the target concerning the guidelines have not, at least from a Danish perspective, not really been realized. I'm fully aware of the fact that there is no enforcement. However, I would have expected our authority to sort of inform of the guidelines and make trade unions and self-employed more aware of the fact that they exist. And what we also hear from this investigation and from the presentation of Christina, there's still the uncertainty that existed before the guidelines. So what's actually the effect if we don't really know out there in practice that they exist and we cannot see an impact? And that's where I'm a little bit puzzled on what's the whole idea of it then.
Yes, thank you very much, Kate. Elias, we want to have a quick reaction on this.
Yeah, so what I can say on this, so first of all, the European Commission communicated also when the guidelines were issued on the guidelines. So I think we did quite some effort on making the public aware. And some competition authorities, I think Christina also mentioned examples, they even issued also statements that are clarifying that they will follow the guidelines. I'm not entirely aware of the Danish situation. However, what we can really say, and I think that is also already has been stressed in the presentation, that we are really in close coordination with the national competition authorities and are making sure that the guidelines are taken into account by their enforcement practice. And what we have seen so far, as mentioned, there has not been any enforcement practice since the issuing of the guidelines. So we also assume that this is to a great extent effective. And when it comes to the general awareness for the guidelines, I think there is, of course, communication that can be done on the part of the authorities, but also there is a lot of capacity building and communication that can be done by stakeholders, and we are really grateful for this opportunity to be here to raise the awareness for the guidelines, but also are thankful for the work that is done by Eurocadres and other stakeholders in raising awareness for the guidelines, and we really hope that this creates greater legal certainty.
Thank you very much, Elias. I can see, Christina, do you want to have just a couple of words? I'm very time sensitive at the moment because we have still 3 more speakers today. So maybe if you can keep it very brief, that would be great.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, because I think this is also very often not well understood, that the Commission in this case could not even legally publish a kind of very, very clear statement saying that all the collective bargaining for all the self-employed is in line with EU law, because it's something that's in the treaty. So the treaty, it cannot be changed by the Commission and has been interpreted by the Court of Justice in a certain way that the Commission also cannot really change. So I think at the moment, this is really the best they can do at the moment, although it's not really, of course, it's kind of unfortunate that we still have legal uncertainty here, but it's not something that could easily be changed. So that's what I wanted to say as a lawyer. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Christina. And we have Martin Williams from ACV has a question related to public procurement. Could you please, Martin, take the floor? I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself via the application, so you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Martin Willems. I'm a representative of SCVCSC United Freelancers. It's a branch of a traditional union, but it's a branch dedicated to unionizing self-employed people, self-employed without any personal, without any employees. So the guidelines are very, very useful. Thank you for this. I just have, and indeed, we got the confirmation also of the Belgian authority for competition that as long as we negotiate alongside the cases that are in the guidelines, there won't be any problem for the Belgian Authority of Public Procurement. So they completely follow the Commission guidelines also. So it's very useful, but recently I had a problem of compatibility of those guidelines with the European provision about public procurement. Why? Because maybe it's an excuse, but some operators are doing public procurement to get services. And as you know, self-employed are companies, so they are subject to public procurement policies. And the operator says to us that it's impossible to discuss anything relating to the working condition or when there is a public procurement, because the public procurement policies forbids this. So I'm in a situation where at one side the guidelines are saying, okay, you can negotiate working conditions for freelancers or self-employed, solo self-employed working in services, but the operator says it's impossible because of the public procurement provisions. So what is your interpretation of this? Thank you.
Very curious question. Thank you very much, Martin. I'm not sure if Christina or Elias, do you have an immediate reaction on that one, especially a brief one? That's I think like this is a wide question and definitely something that we can look into in the workshops. But Elias, Christina, do you have an immediate reaction? I can see that Christina is unmuted already.
Yeah, I can only say that you would really have to look into the details, because I don't see an immediate reason, certainly not on the European law, why this would have to be the stance of the public authority that's doing public procurement. So I would be interested in what exactly is their legal reasoning for saying that this is impossible under public procurement law. I think that's everything I could say on that.
Exactly. Very curious case study. Elias?
For us, the same. I think we can also leave contact details. So if Martin, I think, could briefly line out the facts a bit more precisely. Also, the interaction between the collective bargaining process here and public procurement, that would allow us to provide a more informed answer.
Yes, I can share the contact details amongst you after the call. So thank you very much for the questions and reactions. And keeping in mind that we are quite strict on the schedule at the moment, I would like to hand the floor now to Emmanuelle Lavignac from our UGICT colleagues who is going to be looking into the French situation, and especially the system of the portage salarial, which is quite a particular one. So Emmanuelle, I think you can already share your screen, and I can hand the floor to you directly.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And before sharing my screen, I would like to react to what I have heard so far this morning. And I would like to also apologize to Christina, because we had a very short visual exchange with a technical problem and I wasn't able to get back to her. But regarding the guidelines that we've been speaking about, in France, we have very little heard about this in trade unions. It wasn't at all communicated to trade unions, but you will see this goes into competition with different provisions that already exist in France. These are legal provisions regarding the work of autonomous freelancers with no staff. So I would like to introduce to you a legal provision called wage portage that exists in France, and I will explain a bit how this is related to our topic today, bearing in mind, allow me to share my screen.
Ok. Ok. Alors, comme il a été dit,
So, as it has been
comme je voulais
said,
expliquer, pardon,
and I was trying to explain
en
it
amont, nous avons en
beforehand,
France, comme
we
dans tous
in
les pays d'Europe,
France,
et
as
une
in all
montée
European
assez spectaculaire du
countries,
travail non
have
salarié,
a very
avec
strong
différents statuts qui ont
increase
été
of
créés dans les 20 ou
freelance
30
work, of
dernières années.
independent work, with
Aujourd'hui, par
statutes that
rapport
were
au
created
ce
in
qu'on
the
appelle
last
le
20
portage
years.
salarial, on a à peu près 100
Regarding
000
the
salariés
portage
ou
salarial,
travailleurs
the
qu'on
wage
appelle
portage, we
portés
have about
qui sont sous ce statut.
100,000
Mais on a bien
workers that
évidemment
work
aussi
with
depuis
this
2008 un
statute.
statut d'auto-entrepreneur, de
But we also have a
micro-entrepreneur qui
statute
existe.
of
On a aussi
self-employed
dans le
as a
secteur du journalisme
micro-entrepreneur or
des salariés qu'on appelle
auto-entrepreneur. We also
UGICT,
have
c'est-à-dire
journalists,
qu'ils sont payés à la tâche,
workers that
à la
are
tâche, à
paid
l'article qu'ils vendent à leur
by
journal
the
sans
job,
être
by
jamais
articles
inclus
sold
dans
to
le
the newspaper
dispositif
without ever being
de
included
salarié
into
permanent, on va
any
dire, de seule
permanent
entreprise. Donc en fait, on
wage
a une multitude de
provision.
petits
So we have a
déjà
multitude and a whole
statuts,
array
sachant que,
of
comme vous le savez, il y a la
different
directive des
self-employed
plateformes qui
statutes.
est
And
en
you
train
know
d'être
that the
transposée en France,
directive
où
on
l'on parle aussi de
platforms is
subordination
being
de salariat.
transposed
Donc
in
on compte
France and
beaucoup
does not
là-dessus pour essayer
foresee any
d'avancer sur la
subordination of
structuration
wages. So we have
du
many
travail non
difficulties
salarié.
to advance on the
Et comme vous avez
structuring of
posé auparavant, et on
non-employee
reviendra
work.
à la fin
And
de
as it
mon
has been said,
exposé,
and you will
une
see at the
difficulté
end of
pour
my
les syndicats
presentation, there is a
pour
difficulty
organiser
for
toutes ces
trade
populations.
unions to
Alors, le
organize
portage
all these
salarial, ça a été
populations.
créé
So the
en
wage portage
2008.
was created
Ça
in
existait déjà depuis
2008. It already
1980 à peu
existed
près,
really since
où
the
différents
80s,
salariés, notamment anciens
where
élèves des grandes écoles de
different
commerce françaises,
employees
avaient
in
décidé
great
d'aider les cadres,
commerce
les futurs
schools in
cadres en
France
emploi
had
pour trouver des
decided to
missions.
help
Donc, le
future
portage salarial
managers
ne concerne
to
donc que
find
les travailleurs
specific
très
missions.
qualifiés,
So
de cadres,
this
ingénieurs,
was
etc.
applied to very
En
qualified
2008,
workers like
ce
engineers,
type de
managers, and
mission a
so
été
on.
reconnu dans le
In
Code du travail.
2008, this was
Et nous avons
recognized
depuis
by the
2017 une
Code
convention
of
collective nationale qui
labor,
régit les droits,
and ever
les
since
droits et les intérêts
since
de ces
2017, we
travailleurs.
have a
Donc en
national
convention
collective
collective nationale, donc ça veut
agreement
bien dire que nous
that
négocions
regulates
au
all
niveau
this.
de toute la France, de tout le
So we
territoire.
negotiate
Moi, je
on
suis chargée de
a
cette
national level, and I
négociation qu'on
am
appelle donc
in charge of this
interprofessionnelle
negotiation that we call
sur tout le
interprofessional
territoire et donc
in
paritaire,
French,
donc
all
avec
over
les organisations
France.
patronales et
It is
les
a
organisations
joint
syndicales
negotiation with
représentatives qui sont
trade unions
la
and
CGT, la
employers
CFDT, CGC,
organizations,
et
representative
CFTC.
trade unions, so
D'ailleurs,
CFDT,
ça s'aidera.
CGT, and so
CFTC
on.
a d'ailleurs perdu sa représentativité.
And
Donc, comme je disais tout à l'heure,
CFDT, in
plus de 100
fact,
000
lost
salariés
its
portés.
representativity
Alors, qu'est-ce que c'est que
lately.
le
So
portage
this
salarial?
applies to
C'est un
100,000
statut hybride
workers, as I
entre
said. So what
je suis
is a wage
indépendant,
portage? It is a hybrid
je
status
crée,
between
je vais chercher
being a
ma
freelancer.
clientèle,
I
je fais mon
find
chiffre
my
d'affaires,
own
mais je ne crée pas
clients,
une
my own
entreprise et je
customers.
vais
I
bénéficier
generate
du statut de
my
salarié et de la
own
protection
income,
sociale
but I do
associée.
benefit from
Alors,
the
pourquoi
social
et comment est-ce
protection
qu'on peut
and the
transformer ça?
statute
Eh
of
bien, chaque
an
salarié
employee. So
porté
how do we do this? Each
apporte son chiffre d'affaires à ce qu'on appelle une entreprise de portage salarial
ported
qui transforme ce
wage
chiffre d'affaires en
transforms its
cotisation sociale
income
et salaire.
into social contributions
J'expliquerai ça
and
plus
their own
précisément dans les
wage. I will
futurs, les deux,
explain
trois
this with
statuts.
more detail in the
Les
next slide.
secteurs concernés, je vous disais que les
So
catégories
the
socio-professionnelles,
sectors
c'était
to which
ingénieurs,
this
cadres,
applies, I
techniciens,
told you it's
experts,
mainly
surtout consultants,
engineers, expert
et les
technicians,
secteurs
consultants,
concernés qui utilisent beaucoup ce type
and
de
the ones that use a
travailleurs, ça
lot
va être
this type of
l'informatique, le
workers will
numérique,
be
le conseil
IT,
management, les
digital,
formateurs, beaucoup de formateurs, beaucoup d'enseignants du
consulting and
privé,
management,
les
training,
salariés du marketing,
coaching,
communication, ceux qui travaillent
marketing,
dans le digital, les
communication,
ressources humaines et
digital
aussi
sector I
l'industrie,
already
l'ingénierie, où
mentioned,
on voit de plus en
human
plus se
resources, and also
développer des
industries
ingénieurs
and
qui travaillent
engineering,
en tant
where
que
we see
portés
more and
pour
more
des entreprises
engineers
à la
working
place
as
d'être en CDI,
freelancers
c'est-à-dire
for
le contrat à durée indéterminée,
companies
qui est
rather than
la forme
having
générale
a
de
permanent
contrat en
contract,
France
which
normalement.
used to be the traditional way to work in
Alors,
France
ça repose
before.
sur une relation tripartite. Donc, le
So this
travailleur
is based
porté,
on a
comme je le disais,
tripartite relationship. So the
va chercher
carried
son client. Il a
wage
donc
worker has to look for their own
défini ses
customer.
missions
and client. They have to define their own mission with their client, but at the same time, they're under contract with a company of wage portage. These companies of wage portage, what do they do? What is the interest for the carried worker? Well, because the company with the income generated by the worker will retrieve some contributions for pension, for unemployment and her social security, and then they pay a wage to the worker. So they have a differentiated wage as if they had a permanent contract with a company, and this allows them to contribute and prepare for their future. So they have, hence, social protection. They have different possibilities in terms of contributions. They can be elected as carried over wage worker. This is very recent, but there is a possibility also to present yourself in this wage portage company, representing other workers. So being a sort of a shop steward for other such
comptable et juridique
carried wage workers. This means that not only the company transforms your income into social contributions, but they also do your whole bookkeeping, they secure your work as a freelancer, and they also take management fees, which can have quite an impact on your income. So the consultant, for example, finds a client, they negotiate directly with the client their tariffs and their mission. They make a contract with the wage portage company. This wage portage company contacts the client and creates a service provision contract with that client.
La facturation de cette prestation sera faite par l'entreprise de portage, l'EPS.
So it is then the company, the wage portage company, that invoices to the client. They take in the money and they transform it into a wage. After taking the contributions, the social contributions, and their own management fees, they pay this wage to the worker as if they were a permanent employee. So it is a whole setup that is external to the company. The company, there is no true relationship of subordination of an employee for the worker. The worker is no longer in charge of the social protection of. So the company is not really in charge, the client isn't really in charge of the social protection of the workers, and they have much less responsibilities. And that is why employers solicit such type of statute.
Rapidement, évidemment, quelles sont les limites? Alors,
for employers, this means much less responsibility. So there is the possibility for the worker to be elected and represent other workers and participate to a trade union. But obviously, it is quite a weak trade union representation. We say that there are 100,000, but it's very difficult to know exactly how many they are. And they are not always aware of the fact that they can be represented by trade unions. So they are not naturally drawn towards trade unions, which means they have a very weak representation. However, they can negotiate on a national level collective agreements for the protection of their rights. But since their representation in trade unions is weak, the organization is also weak. So the power relationship is quite light, which means that we negotiate on national level with employers who have much more power, since they manage to impose whatever they want to impose in terms of complementary services and social protection and so on. And this doesn't go in the favor of the wage portage worker. So we have a need of organizing more of them, of increasing our base of wage portage workers, and this is what we are trying to work inside trade unions. However, this is interesting in terms of social protection and the possibility to participate in collective bargaining. However, in terms of what the law imposes, the statute remains quite blurry because it can be accumulated with other statutes. If you have different clients, for example, or different employers, you can decide that to one employer you will propose such type of contract through the wage portage company, but at the same time, you can also accumulate it with a short-term contract for another employer. You can also be an unemployment perceiver, because if your full income isn't sufficient for you to have a status of, professional or employee, then you need unemployment fees. And this is a system that can benefit to the worker, but for now it is still much more beneficial for employers because it doesn't force them to recruit permanent workers. And we know that in France, very often employers say that the real cost is linked to the what really bothers, what we see in France is that what really bothers employers is not so much the cost of a permanent worker, it's really more the obligation, the moral obligation, and the whole series of obligations that this entails. They don't want this type of responsibility over 20, 30 years towards the workers anymore. So they can do 2 contracts of 18 months, but then it has to be over. Otherwise, you have to recruit permanently the worker, which means that employers have found many ways to go around this by changing the objective of the mission simply. And we know that there are many cumulations that are superior to 18 months, to twice 18 months. So it's not fully secured yet. There are many loopholes for employers. And finally, the last problem is the management fees, which are decided on national level. And these management fees can represent up to 10% on the income of the workers, which is huge. We have legal cases right now saying that, wait, management fees going up to 10%, you are taking it off the income of the worker, which leads to litigations in courts. And this is a statute that we wanted to introduce because I don't know if on a European level this exists, if this exists elsewhere. So these are its limitations. And I would like to conclude with one advantage. This allows for independent workers, for professionals to have a social protection and most importantly to participate to social security for all workers in the end, whether in permanent contracts or short-term contracts. This allows for them to contribute to the rights of everyone somehow. So it is interesting even from general interest, societal general interest point of view. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm here to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Emmanuelle. And I would move forward to make sure that we have enough time for all the presenters. So our next speaker is from the Italian side, Nicola. And Nicola, I suggest that you can already start with your talking points, and Emmanuelle, I'm going to help you with unsharing the screen. Go ahead, Nicola. 10 minutes.
Actually, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but by the way, we are going to send a document after this webinar. In our legal system, collective bargaining traditionally represented a crucial element for employee, and while excluding self-employed people, changes in labor market with the increase of self-employed people who are not companies, and so all these changes have entailed a discussion about the protections of self-employed people. Self-employed people carry out a personal and individual activity, and so there is a lack of subordination. That's why there is a lack of collective bargaining in a traditional way, because actually those kind of workers are considered as people, as a worker who are independent from an economic point of view. Actually, we can see that an awful lot of self-employed people, namely the economically dependent workers, are in a difficult situation from a contractual point of view, and this is the same thing, the same situation that they had, the same situation as employees. So, and this is something that we want to stress. Some steps forward have been taken in our country, such as a law in 1987, which does not consider on the same level employees and self-employed, but some protection principles have been added while valuing the role played by trade unions in bargaining for these workers, such as collective agreements for compensation and access to security, social security protection. So collective bargaining, according to the examples that we have in Italy, is developed through sectoral collective agreements that are signed by associations and trade unions. So, but we have to underscore that those agreements have not the same effectiveness as collective agreements, but they are important in order to establish some guidelines and in order to rebalance the relations between the client and self-employed workers. So we have been discussing about collective bargaining, the guidelines that have been established by the European Commission. We will see the impact of these guidelines on for these workers. So we can say, and then I will give you some examples. So we can say that the collective bargaining for self-employed people is evolving. But by the way, we do not have a common principle, a common law, but there are some features that are really important, because collective bargaining is important in order to ensure professional dignity and good wages for self-employed people, and this make a huge contribution in order to harmonize the industrial relations system in Italy. In the last years, beyond the acknowledgement of self-employed people, we have been developing different experiences of collective agreements in order to regulate self-employed work. So in some sectors in which there is a huge fragmentation and a huge contractual weakness, because in this case we do not have a traditional collective agreement, but by the way, we have some tools in order to regulate industrial relations. So there is an important element, an important mechanism that is represented. It's the collective agreement for a sort of self-employed workers, and those collective agreements are signed in some services, such as the service, some sectors, such as the service sector, and the same employers signing the collective agreement for employees, in some cases as in other cases, the contract, the agreement is signed by other trade unions department, and these agreements are really important in order to establish some protections for workers that are exposed to economic competition. And then there is a further issue that we have to take into account, and the code of conduct, for example, we have some collective agreements that have been established by other professional associations. So because actually we have introduced the role of equal fee, which has been strengthened by the current law, and that this is something important in order to fix a fair rate for professionals. And there is a further example which is represented by collective agreement for digital workers. In this case, there are some agreements signed by NEEDL CGIL in order to regulate the work which is done by shoppers, and some elements have been regulated, such as rate compensation and trade union rights as well. And by doing that, we have established a comparison between the law existing for employees and the rules, the conditions existing for self-employed people. And then we have further examples related to sales agent working in the trade sector, with some collective agreements that have been signed by trade unions, signing collective agreements for employees and so we are working, we have been working a lot in the social security field for self-employed workers in order to see how we can include self-employed worker in these agreements. And because actually related to social security in work benefits, for example, because we think that self-employed people have the right to have access to working benefits related to pensions, for example. And the further element is related to lifelong learning, lifelong training, because actually all the protections, all the measures that I have quoted are protections, are measures that are really are only that have been conceived for employees and not for self-employed people, worker, even if so hence the need to enhance working benefits as well. And so by way of a conclusion, and I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to take the floor. I think that all these examples show how collective bargaining has not been organized in a fully fledged way. And this is not something general, if I may say so, because we cannot find collective collective agreements for all the self-employed people in working in all sectors. But I think that collective bargaining for self-employed people is something really important in the current labor market. Hence the importance for Eurocadres have has decided to devote a webinar in order to dwell on this issue, which is a priority in several countries. So we are going to send our contribution, and we are going to add some examples related to collective bargaining in some specific sectors in the media, sport, for example, because here you have an hybrid nature of the worker relation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I can see that we are slightly actually on at the end of our timetable. Many thanks for the flexibility for the interpreters, especially, and also for the participants. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Markus from the Finnish freelance journalist. And if there is any urgent questions, please put it in the chat rather than have them as a separate intervention. So without further ado, Maria, the floor is yours. So I believe you have a presentation also to share, right?
Yeah. All right. So can you see the presentation and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So thank you for inviting me. I try to be effective in my 10 minutes talk and wrap up some steps and successes we've made here in Finland concerning this issue. The steps are maybe quite small, but to the right direction. So in this 10 minutes time, we will go through these issues shortly. So the timeline since September 22, the current situation and plans and means to success. Shortly about myself. So I'm a freelance journalist from Finland. I've worked independently almost 20 years. I've been active in our trade union, the Union of Journalists in Finland, since that. And for the past few years, I've been the chairperson of Finnish Freelance Association, which belongs to the Union of Journalists in Finland. We have about 1,400 members in our association, and our union has about 14,000 members. And during my own chair period in our association, which is about 4 years now, so my strategy has been tightening the relations with our mother union and trying to get the employed members who make the strong majority in our union to understand the struggle and as independent workers and entrepreneurs, and that we are really at the same boat with the employed people. And I feel this is a good strategy. And I want to say already at this point that nothing of these good things that I'm going to dig in now wouldn't happen if our mother union, so the Union of Journalists, would not have been so active speaker and doer for us. So the Union of Journalists in Finland has long worked to ensure that self-employed workers, journalists and media workers can have collectively negotiated working conditions and fair fees. And here is the timeline of the work already done since September 22, because then the Commission approved these guidelines we've been talking about. And these guidelines gave the Union of Journalists an opportunity to propose negotiations with the Finnish Media Federation, which is an advocacy organization for private companies in the media and printing industries. Anyway, let's say it's not on a timeline, but March 23, the Media Federation announced it would refuse to negotiate with the Union of Journalists over the freelancers' working conditions and fees, claiming collective agreements to be illegal. Well, the union kept working on other sectors, and then for the first time in history, the minimum fees for sole entrepreneurs were agreed in the collective agreement for audiovisual translators. So you can see that on the timeline, April 23. So, and the September 23 to FCCA, which is a Finnish competition and consumer authority confirmed that trade unions may negotiate working conditions for self-employed workers with employers. The FCCA also published a blog post on the matter, and I can say that our union worked hard to make this happen. Still, despite this FCCA's statement, the Media Federation confirmed it would not engage in collective negotiations on self-employed workers' fees and minimum working conditions. The federation was like a stone wall, and after hitting our heads towards it enough, so we made new plans. Hence, we started preparing objectives under which the union began approaching Media Federation member companies directly. So that meant that because the Media Federation wouldn't negotiate, we chose another strategy and decided to go around it and contact its member organizations one by one. And that's what we have been doing since, with quite good results. Now, today, around 10 separate agreements for self-employed have been concluded over past 2 years, mainly with individual publishers, newspapers, and trade union publications. In addition, several letters of intent and pay increases have been agreed, which are not full agreements, but have strengthened the negotiating position of self-employed. And about the latest happenings, which I see a bit disappointing setback, is that the Finnish Union of Journalists and the Media Federation finally agreed to meet with the competition authorities together to negotiate there last autumn, but it never happened though. It didn't happen because after some back and forth, the Finnish Competition and Consumer Authority said it would not meet the unions together or act as a go-between. So instead, the authority told each organization to come forward on its own, based on its own competition law self-assessment. And that's what we are going to do again. So the Union of Journalists has now asked for the meeting with the competition authority in January or February. So the work continues. Then quickly, a couple of words about the means of success. So the key thing is that our union has been doing steady, long-term work to improve conditions for self-employed. So kind of basic work that happens every day, which include legal advice, fee recommendations, guides, training, all that. And then I see very important thing, this communication, because quite often the union and we get the questions from members like, why doesn't the union do anything? Why don't you do anything? So we've been, for the past couple of years, we've been really active in communication towards our members about what happens with the negotiations. So every time we have meeting, so we are making a public kind of like newsletter or something to our members, so they kind of feel that we are really working for them and things are moving on, even though the progress is really slow. And yeah, then just that we see that the legislative path is increasingly important. So it requires more statements and hearings and a lot of cooperation with different other organizations. And also the international cooperation, I say it's really important. These kind of meetings to hear what happens all around. So yeah, and the last thing what I want to say in this short time is that I can't address enough the role of our mother union. So I'm very happy personally that the Union of Journalists, it really has taken steps and really it feels like they understand the self-employed situation nowadays, but we've been working hard to make it that way. But now we have really good cooperation, and it's much better to get more things moving when you have the wider shoulders. I mean our union. So that's about it, my part. So I'm finished. I'm short and effective in my words. So thank you very, very much for this time, and please ask questions if something comes up.
Thank you very much, Maria. I don't see actually any other questions in the chat, and considering that we are actually a bit over time, in that case, if there's any questions, I'm happy to facilitate those also after the webinar, so feel free to send those to my email directly or to Eurocadres Secretariat email. And for the closing, I would ask our President Nayla Glaise to take the floor and give a couple of remarks, because there has been a lot of food for thought, and I'm personally looking forward to also keep on working on this project and take these webinar findings and comments to the next steps in the workshops, which we are hopefully starting in the end of March, but more information on that to follow on. So Nayla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ilkka. Thank you very much. And thank you, colleagues, for staying in this webinar. I would like to thank also the presenters. They were very, very interesting presentations, very different and complete each other. Thank you, Christina, for the whole work that is done on the research part. I would like also to inform you that the report should be ready soon. It will be published on our website, and we will send it to you once it is ready. It will be also translated in different languages, so you can share it with your colleagues in your different unions. Also, I would like to thank the Commission that joined us today, and hopefully that they will join us also in our workshops. So the next workshop will be 26-27 of March. It will be in Dublin. So you will all receive the invitation, and we hope we see many of you in this workshop, where we will have some activities also together. First, to better understand the guidelines and how to apply them. As we have seen, we have heard also from you, and we already know that many unions are not aware of these guidelines. We know it. And the national authorities are not communicating at the national level on this. So this is also one important thing of this project, is that everyone should be aware of that this exists and how we can use them. Would like to thank also the three presenters, Emmanuelle, Nicola, and Maria from Finland. Thank you for your presentation. We will have more of these in the workshops. And I would like to thank the interpreters, especially that we have also exceeded our contractual time. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you all soon in Dublin. Have a good day. Thanks. Bye-bye.